You write about the echoes of 1973. Not a great economic picture here in the U.S. Then all of a sudden war breaks out in the Middle East. And you note that an energy crisis can snowball into a wildly unpredictable everything crisis more quickly than governments can manage. Let's start with just the aptness of the comparison. So here we are in the early days of this war. How good an analog is what we're experiencing now to what happened then?
I think it's pretty good because you've got to start with the domestic political context. That's one place to start. In 73, Nixon was in the middle of Watergate. He had another year or so of his presidency. So the White House was just a terrible place to be. You had inflation was spiking. He tried price controls the year before. But in the economy as a whole, there was an affordability crisis going on. The loaf of bread had doubled. And then you had this oil price spike. Now, it wasn't just the war that started it. The producer countries had been raising prices. It's essentially they'd taken back control of oil from the Western majors that had controlled it for many years. So you had this combination of an administration that was really, you couldn't really trust its motives. You had a genuine affordability crisis, inflation spiking, and then this breaks out. And you don't really know how this is going to spin out of control.
So when you look back, I mean, there's a saying, history doesn't repeat, but it does echo. Is this more of a direct repetition? Is it an echo? And are there specific lessons that this administration should be learning from this time in history when there were very similar circumstances?
Well, I think everyone always wants these things to go as quickly as possible.
Yeah.
And I think what you're seeing today is exactly that. The Yom Kippur War actually only lasted a couple of weeks before there was a ceasefire brokered by the Soviet Union and the United States. But the effects of it lasted a lot longer, largely because oil prices quadrupled between October and the end of the year. And again, due to the factors I've explained, not just the war, but other sort of macro factors. And I think what you saw then was less developed countries really struggled to pay their bills. Even developed countries like the UK, European countries started having to borrow at enormous rates to just to sustain their economies. And so this thing really dictated the future of the global economy for 2, 3, 4 years, going on through the 70s.
We think of the images from 1973, folks lined up down blocks and around corners waiting to fill up their cars. It was difficult to do, and obviously that had a dramatic effect on sentiment in this country. How do you think about that, the way in which the American public is processing this particular war, this crisis, at a time when the rationale for it hasn't exactly been made clear by the administration?
Well, to go back to the context, I think there is a context of mistrust. You know, what is this administration doing? What are we supposed to believe? Tariffs are supposed to have raised billions, and now here is a war costing billions by the end. A tax cut has been put in place. You have pressure on the Federal Reserve to cut interest rates when inflation is going up. So I think a lot of people are looking around and going, why? What is this? Can we afford it? What's going to happen next? Why isn't there more of a focus on what my household goods basket is costing? Is this a war that's a reckless thing for America to pursue? And a lot of people still remember what happened 20 years ago. That's not out of the public memory. So you have gas lines in the 70s, but also a war that started with the prediction that we'd be in and out of Iraq quickly. And that wasn't the case at all.
One of the other things you talk about is the impacts it had on cars and the kinds of cars people were buying. And right, I feel like we keep going through these cycles. And right now, gas has been cheap for a while. Manufacturers are going back away from electric, or big SUVs are on the street again. If this continues to have a knock-on effect, as you mentioned, for several years, do you think we're going to see that reflected in the kind of cars Americans are driving?
Certainly. I mean, in the 70s, the beginning of the 70s, the fashion was these 8-mile-an-hour land yachts, these enormous cars, the Buick Rivera.
Big boats.
Big boats with kind of velvet front seats. And air conditioning was going in cars, which vastly increased the cost to run cars. But by the end of the 70s, you had Civics from Honda, you had the Rabbit from Volkswagen. The Japanese and German small cars really started to take off. It took a while. But American tastes really changed by the end of the 70s as people realized there was money to be saved doing this.
Let me ask you last about my favorite part of the essay, and that is the effect this had on popular culture. So yes, we think about how it impacted folks at their kitchen tables, but as you know, it really changed the way folks entertained themselves, the way that sporting events were run. Talk a bit about that, just the effects then and the legacy of that going into this crisis.
Well, there were all kinds of crazy things happened. In early 74, the Daytona 500 became the Daytona 450.
Unbelievable.
Because they only could go 450 miles around the track. The James Bond film, The Man with the Golden Gun, in late 74, was all about this thing called the Solex agitator. It was essentially a device to conserve solar energy, and it was about the rise in the use of solar energy. And Bond thinks the sheikhs will try and buy it, the oil sheikhs will buy it to raise the price of oil. You had truckers who had protested the oil price rises become these kind of modern cowboys. And so in the 70s, you get films like Every Which Way But Loose, Clint Eastwood with an orangutan in a truck. But the trucker had become this kind
Couldn't
of
be made
cultural
today.
figure, which you can actually
So
apply to the
problematic.
effects.
Do you see that happening? I mean, do you expect to see this creep into Hollywood, pop culture, all of the above?
I don't think you can avoid it over time. If this goes on, oil crises just are they affect everything in our lives. They not only affect geopolitics, but they affect the way we live. As you said, we've been dialing back on electric vehicles in what now seems like a terrible moment. We've been doing that. And eventually, you'll see it in music, you'll see it in films. This will become a moment that people remember like they remember the 70s.